Martin, you've argued today that we've made a mess of the way that we run companies and that this mess is called maximising shareholder value. Why is it such a mess?
I think the essential argument is that it's two things that come together. If you argue that companies exist to maximise shareholder value, and if you have an active market and corporate control, you essentially compel executives to do so. The core argument I made in this, which follows an argument by an academic, Colin Mayer at the Side Business School, is that this makes it very difficult for companies to make credible long-term commitments to everybody who deals with them, because the management can always be displaced, removed to answer the short-term needs of shareholders. And that, the argument goes, and I believe it is correct, undermines the biggest single advantage of the corporation, in some sense why we have it, which is that it is the perfect instrument for making long-term commitments, which depend on trust, which cannot be specified precisely. They're implicit contracts, but they are incredibly valuable implicit contracts. So the argument is, in essence, as a result, lots of potentially valuable economic exchange over the very long term doesn't happen.
But is it true that the companies are all run in the interests of short-term shareholders? A lot of shareholders are long-term in their outlook. And there are examples of areas where companies are run nominally for their shareholders, but actually it's other groups that extract the benefit from these organisations. And if you look, for instance, at investment banks, in theory run for shareholders, there it's the staff that extract the value. If you look at UK supermarkets at the moment, in the middle of a price war, these are being run really for the benefit of their customers, not the shareholders that are extracting value. So although these companies are run with shareholder value in mind, they actually produce a far more diverse set of outcomes simply than just benefiting shareholders in the short term.
I think that's very important. So let's separate a few elements in this. The dominant way any companies operate in a competitive market for goods and services, and I think that applies in some sense however they're governed, whether they're governed by family shareholders, insider shareholders, or sort of standard British style diversified shareholders. The dominance of the market pressure is overwhelming, and actually I think that's the most important single factor in determining whether a market economy works and whether corporations work. So if you're taking the example of the price war, well, I expect price wars to occur in any competitive economy, more or less irrespective of the corporate's governance structure, because companies do exist to serve their customers, and if they fail to do so, they will be beaten in the market, and if they're bad enough, they will be destroyed and disappeared. And we have many examples of that. So make very, very clear, I'm not discussing that or questioning that. I actually think that's the most important thing about the economy. Now then, the second question is, how effective is the market and corporate control in ensuring that the interests of shareholders are served? You're absolutely right that in companies which are very difficult to take over, very large investment banks are a good example. There are other ultra huge companies which are effectively can't be taken over. I think you can't imagine it happening. They can be operated for the benefit of their staff at the expense of shareholders. Now, do I worry about the fact that Goldman might be operating in the interests of staff as opposed to shareholders? No, I don't think that's the biggest problem about Goldman. I'm much more worried about whether it's operating actually, or such businesses are operating in the interest of the customers at large. But I accept there are companies that can take very long-run views, though, take Goldman case, I think it's got much more problematic to square these circles, since it ceased to be a partnership, which is the other way of managing such businesses.
In your article, you suggest various other ways of managing. Maybe the staff could be given some influence. Maybe there should be a sort of set of principles along which lines the company should be run. Now, shareholders might argue that if you do this, if you take some of the control away from shareholders, you will increase the cost of equity for that company, and it will damage it in that way. Is that not a valid point?
Yes, I think it's probably it's true. It might properly reflect the true cost of equity. The question, in a way, is that the question, not in a way. The question is If you give shareholders more control, the price of equity might well fall. The question is what losses are associated with that, namely how far, because the management are constantly looking over their shoulders of what the stock market is thinking, and therefore what might happen to their own tenure, and are being rewarded on that basis, that there are lots of things they can't do which also impose losses on companies. It's very, very important to understand. Companies are a very, very complex institution. Minimizing its cost of equity is not the sole objective of a company, absolutely clearly. It might well be that accepting that equity owners have somewhat less control actually will increase the value of the company, increase ultimately the returns to shareholders. But, of course, it is possible that shareholders, particularly ones that are not prepared to commit themselves long term, will demand a somewhat higher price, and I would accept that consequence.
Martin, thank you very much.